men returned by another way. It wasn't in their original plan. Their carefully laid itinerary was in shambles, and those AAA maps they got were no use now. They returned another way. And of course, this is a much more significant change than rerouting the GPS. It indicates a real change of heart took place and mind, resulting in change action. They did not go back to Herod. They did not go back to the capital, the halls of power, prestige, and authority. In fact, they disobeyed the authorities, aiding and abetting a fugitive of the law. In beholding Jesus, they witnessed a king who showed them another way to live. And this Advent, as we journey to Bethlehem, will our hearts and minds be changed? Will it affect the way we live? And will we join the wise men and return another way? Thinking about that star of Bethlehem, anyone could have seen the sign. The Magi didn't receive some secret vision or a private message. They observed a star rising, something that would have been visible to hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. Astronomer Michael Molnar in The Star of Bethlehem argues that this was the conjuncture of Jupiter and Saturn on April 17, 6 BC. To the naked eye, it would have appeared like a new star, and the retrograde motion of Jupiter would account for the star stopping in verse 9. Whether it was this or some other phenomenon, it would have been bright and memorable to Matthew's original audience. Yet, how many came seeking Christ? Only a handful of magi from the east. Will we journey with the Magi this Christmas? Now, of course, you can hardly go anywhere this time of year without seeing signs of Christmas. Every coffee shop has holiday menus, and every main street is decorated, and low-flying aircraft need to avoid those newer and higher and brighter stars of Bethlehem that pop up all over. It's everywhere. According to a 2019 Gallup poll, 93% of Americans celebrate Christmas, joining over 2 billion people in 160 countries worldwide. Yet, in January, when we toss out those dried-out fire hazards into the street, and the world goes back to how it was, one will wonder, what did they all think the message of Christmas was about? They returned the same way they came. They didn't change, and the world didn't change. So what would it take for us to live the message of Christmas? What would it take for us to be like the wise men who returned by another way? I remember a conversation I had with an international student, and they were not from one of the 160 countries that celebrated it. So as a first-timer to Christmas, he'd been going to Starbucks, and he got his very first eggnog latte, and they'd been to the parks for lights, and been ice skating, and introduced to all those good classic American Christmas characters, like Ralphie in The Christmas Story, all bundled up, Jim Carrey in The Grinch, and even Bruce Willis in Die Hard. Yes, it is a Christmas movie. And when I asked him what he thought about Jesus, he was a bit taken aback, as if I was going off topic. What does Jesus have to do with Christmas? Sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to make us realize our own. And in Matthew's gospel, the Magi are the outsiders. In the Greek, it's magoi. Magi being our transliteration, and likely these are the only magi you know about. But you know another word from this Greek root very well, magicians. You see, these were likely pagan idol-worshiping Gentile astrologers. Not exactly characters you'd be comfortable having in your nativity. And if you doubt this, every other use of Magoi in the New Testament is explicitly negative. And Matthew's original Jewish audience certainly would have heard it so. These were outsiders to their story. Yet according to Matthew, these are the only ones who came. The shepherds are in Luke. What sort of Messiah would this be? You can see why this frightened Herod and all Jerusalem with him. And for those of us who need to hear the Christmas story most, Christ's birth in Bethlehem is frightening indeed. It's why Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol may be the most theologically profound story of the season. As Ebenezer Scrooge needed to be frightened by the ghost of Jacob Marley and the spirits of Christmas past, present, and future, we too, like Scrooge, need to be frightened by the Magi. What is the meaning of this? Scrooge cried. Yet it was in his fright that he began to finally see life clearly. His occupation, its economic corrupt system, and all his pursuits as they actually were. This is the fright we need this Christmas. The fright that will help us see the story anew. The fright that will open us to the true joy of the season, the real meaning of Christmas. For the problem with Scrooge wasn't that he wouldn't hang a wreath or celebrate festivities. And the problem for us isn't that we can celebrate them too much. No, the problem is always in our hearts, in our minds, and the choices we make every day, not just Christmas Day. And what strikes me more and more about the Christmas Carol as I grow older, and I know I'm like the youngest person here, is that it's the story of an old man. And so many of our holiday tropes center around children, and perhaps rightly. But the miracle of the incarnation is for everyone. And it is wonderful seeing a child experience the joys for the first time. And it's also equally amazing to hear an octogenarian tell me, I've never read the Bible like that before. And the reason why we return to the story year after year is because we haven't finished being changed by it. And maybe, perhaps, one of the reasons we're slow to change is that we seldom tell the whole story. There are parts of the story we don't tell our children. And there's an obvious and correct reason why our Advents get ended at verse 12. But we kept reading to verse 18. If the Bible were a movie, it'd be rated NC-17, the only rating worse than R. Because, Herod was a wicked ruler, and the slaughter of innocents is deeply disturbing. Yet, is it any more disturbing than the children being slaughtered in the land of Jesus' birth as we speak? Because it's only in that full story of Christmas we find a narrative capable of both threatening and overcoming the powers and principalities of the world. The kind of story that, like Mary saying, casts down the mighty and sends the rich away empty. The violent will always see more violence as the solution. Only the Prince of Peace, born in Bethlehem, is capable of threatening violence itself. As Simone Weil said, the false God changes suffering into violence. The true God changes violence into suffering. As churches in Bethlehem this year cancel celebrations and refugees press themselves against the Egyptian border, we are reminded of the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, because they too had to flee the violence of the ruling class. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus became refugees and immigrants in a foreign land. And they escaped, yes, but imagine their survivors' guilt and all those who didn't make it. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. This is part of the full story of Christmas. And if we don't remember it, then all we have are sugar cookies and lukewarm punch. When people tell me they've left the faith, not merely hopping over to some other church, a common thread is suffering. They find they had an experience they could no longer square with the God they were taught to believe in. And this God was often distant, all-powerful, majestic, beautiful, and in control of every detail. And so when the details of life became too painful, God was either at fault or incompetent, and they no longer cared. And I always leave those conversations wondering if they actually read Jesus' life, if they even made it past the beginning. Because you can't make it past the second chapter of the New Testament without encountering this front and center. Jesus is born, and innocents get slaughtered. And if you keep reading, Jesus gets slaughtered by Herod another 31 years later. And so when we wonder where God is when innocents suffer, it is right there in the suffering. And if this doesn't sound like good news to you, I think we all have to let go of our grasp of power. Herod may have been an especially wicked ruler, but you know what? There are always going to be more Herods. Furthermore, it doesn't even matter if the emperor is Christian or where the bombs get made. When innocents die, mothers will continue weeping with Rachel, weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. A false god turns to violence to combat violence. But in Jesus, we see a God who met the violence of this world with suffering from the moment of his birth to the moment of his death. And only in Jesus will the violence of this world be overcome. The Prince of Peace who threatens the world as we know it. The Prince of Peace who gives us a world that will not be overcome by darkness. And if you think this is wrong, read the Gospels front to back. Read the New Testament. We are never justified in violence, and that will always threaten those in power. And it's here we come to the crux of our story. Knowing who Jesus is. Does his coming frighten us, or does it bring us overwhelming joy? It was the Magi, pagan astrologers and magicians steeped in dark arts, who knew the power of darkness better than most to show us anew this Christmas story. Because they were from a pagan land that didn't know the living God. And when they saw the Messiah, when they saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with joy. He was not born in the halls of power and wealth and privilege, but in poverty and humility. And he emptied himself of power. This is the king who would change the world. And this king changed the Magi's life. They became wise men, and they returned another way. And when you see Christ as the Magi did, through the eyes of those foreigners, you begin to see the true joy of Christmas. And this joy of Christmas won't be found in a concert or along a pretty walk or snuggled up under the mistletoe. It won't be found in the perfect present or family feast. These are all cultural niceties that anyone can enjoy. You don't need Jesus to have fun at Christmas. Ask the 2 billion people who celebrate it. But if you want to be overwhelmed with joy like the Magi, if you want to experience transformation like Ebenezer Scrooge, then it's going to go much deeper. It's going to go into your heart and change your mind about things maybe you believed your whole life. And your budget, maybe that will look entirely different. You might end up with strangers in your house. I didn't write this in, but I'll never forget my great aunt. My great aunt Dorothy. We always called her Crazy Aunt Dorothy, not to her face. And one day the preacher told us about welcoming strangers into the home. And so Dee, she literally went out in the streets and didn't tell anyone and invited all these people who were homeless to Thanksgiving without telling her family. And so on Thanksgiving, the house was full of all these strangers who smelled more than a little bad. But I was like, isn't that part of what living the gospel out is? Like what Jesus did. And it's uncomfortable sometimes. But we'll see that a new way of life is possible. Because a little boy in Bethlehem showed it was possible. Because Jesus didn't just live in order to die. But Jesus lived to show us that we can finally live as God intended. It doesn't matter if this is your first time hearing it or your 102nd time. It's a story for everyone. For kids from 1 to 92. And although it's been said many times in many ways, may this Christmas be a new thing for you. May it overwhelm you with joy. May it give you the courage to reject every Herod you see and resolutely find another way. Whenever violence offers itself as the expedient solution, may you embrace our Savior anew. May you walk the path of the Prince of Peace, the Messiah born in Bethlehem. And may the light of his life, the light of that star, guide us on our journey each and every day as we return another way. Amen.